Hi, Chris Delion here again for the next video in the series for dynamic website generation. I'm a TA for LMC 6313 taught at Georgia Tech, and we've got a website for that course, LMC 6313, fall 13. Principles of Interactive Design. This next video, in the previous ones focused on some introductory PHP, some introductory using forms and get and post parameters into PHP. This time we'll be looking at databases, putting one together sort of by hand a little bit, so to speak, in phpMyAdmin at first, and then showing just the very, very beginnings of how we can use PHP to interact with it. Now, if you are, this video is going to be different if you're a student at Georgia Tech than if you're not. Of course, we welcome people not at Georgia Tech to follow these videos as well. But if you're at Georgia Tech, you have a self-serve database system you can use at this URL. At least that's the case at the time of this video. db.iac, databases, Ivan Allen College, .gotech.edu/databases. And when you get here, you may not see one listed yet. This is one I've added manually, and you can do it with create new database. Of course, on your screen, if you do have one, you're not going to see this blue block here. That's me blocking out my MySQL password so it's not on the internet in a YouTube video. But so if you don't have one listed yet, you're just going to go to create new database. Now, by the way, if you're not a student at Georgia Tech, there are other ways to get set up with an SQL database. As a student outside, or as a just individual outside of being a student here at this college, I host my website on startlogic.com as one of many different services available out there that offer MySQL as part of the package. And through that, there's a whole different setup for how you'd instantiate a database, get the password for it. But once you get that figured out, and there's probably some way to navigate that through their tutorials or instructions, then a lot of everything we're covering here will still apply for how to use phpMyAdmin and PHP to interact with SQL databases. So we're going to create a new database first. You can give it a name. You could really name it anything. You're likely to use multiple tables on it for a number of different assignments. So something generic for the course might be appropriate, or even just generic for your account. You might name it after your username. Other users, if you needed other people to be able to access it. So if you're wanting to put your TA's information in here, this could be useful for him or her to be able to double check that, if you have a question about your database interactions, they can log in as themselves and still see it in their phpMyAdmin. Then you'll click create, which I've already done ahead of time, which is why mine is here. And again, you're seeing my password blocked out, but it's also going to have to show up. We're going to need that in a moment for our files. Now, some of the time when you're in phpMyAdmin, it's going to log you out from being logged in too long. If you say leave it open in a tab for a while, come back to it maybe the next day or even just a few hours later, that password and this username are useful to keep around. That's how you're going to log back into phpMyAdmin. It's not going to be your T-square or your email username and password. It's going to be these here that are uniquely assigned from the database self-serve system. So keep those handy, and you're going to want those later. Then next we're going to click on Manage. That's going to open up a phpMyAdmin. You don't need that text file yet. phpMyAdmin window. Let me give this a little more room. It's going to be tricky. Of course, I'm always trying to squeeze my video on the screen too. And over here, you should see the new database you've created. We click on that. You won't see any tables yet. These are tables I've already added for examples in classes and labs, demonstrations. But you're going to create one first by going to Create Table here on the left, or if you already know how many columns you want, and I'll explain that here in a moment, kind of the more versatile way to do it is you put your name for it down here on the screen under Create Table on Database, and number of columns here, we could list number of columns. So number of columns is how many variables we want to kind of keep track of per each entry in the database. And because we almost always want to have a unique index to go with each database entry, it's often the number of variables you'd want for it plus one, the extra plus one being the database entry for it. So for example, let's say we just want to keep track of contact information. Then we might want first name, last name. We might want to keep track of time of birth. If we want to be fancy for birthdays and stuff. We could keep track of an address. And so there's four things of information. That would be 4 columns plus 1 for a total of 5. That extra would just be a unique identifier, so that every user in the database would have a unique number. So you're starting at 1, then 2, then 3, and so on. And of course, that's where our original Facebook user ID numbers come from, and so on. But that's going to be useful when we start building linking tables later on for relationships between database tables. But so as an example, let's do that one there of contact information. So let's name our table contacts. Number of columns, like we said, let's do first name, last name, date of birth, and address. So we got 4, but then 5 because we want that unique identifier for each one. I'm going to click Go to Proceed. Now again, it's going to be tricky because of my camera filling up screen space. In fact, oh boy, let me see if I can maybe use the bottom of my screen better without getting too much in the way of this video. And it appears, there we go. Okay, I think that's going to work. Sorry about that. I didn't anticipate having that much trouble just getting this thing to fit. Oh geez. So they've recently updated their interface, but I think we're now in control of it. Okay, so it turns out this works like a little GUI inside it, as you've seen. At this point, it's not too late to rename the table. We could change the name of it. If you ask for fewer columns, if you only ask for like 2, maybe even 3 columns, it might give you vertical columns to fill in. If you ask for 4 or more, it'll start to do this horizontal layout where it's asking you for column information in a row format. It's just a matter of where the information fits. And so for the first one, let's say contact ID type. And so this is where we can specify the type of information that this row, I guess rather this column, has in the database. And so, for example, if it's a word, then we would want varchar, which is a variable number of characters that has a known maximum size. And so, for example, we're probably never going to have a name that's 100 characters long. We could put that at 100. Text is sort of arbitrarily long block of text, so we could use that for a blog post. We could use that for comments that people post in a forum. It's things where we can't really anticipate ahead of time. Okay, I know it's never going to be more than 50 characters or whatnot, and that's much slower to deal with for the database. That's part of why we don't use it any more than we have to. It's harder for these things to be optimized in the same way as when it's juggling either numbers or at least bodies of text of a known maximum size. Now, also, this is going to be my point in the video, and I'm going to remind, as I always do, 2 things. One, if the text on my screen here on this video looks too small for you, I am recording these and submitting these at 720 to YouTube, so you can use the gear at somewhere down here in the YouTube video to increase the resolution to HD, full screen it, and then you should be able to see the text at the same resolution that it is on my screen. Additionally, this course is designed for designers to be able to make prototypes, to implement functional demonstrations of ideas, to then show other developers to, basically, we're not trying to train people here to be top-level software engineers. And so consequently, there's a lot of nuances to how you can do databases in very specific, very careful, very planned ways in terms of how you architect the information for faster access and so on. We're not really touching those here. We're dealing with this in the simplest fashion we can that'll get things working. We're prototypers and we're designers in this community, and that's sort of the idea we're going for. So even though there's many different types of integers that we could choose between, anytime we want to use a number that's a whole number, we're basically just going to use an int. Likewise, there's multiple forms of float or of decimal value. There's multiple forms of date that we could store. We're not going to deal with that sort of nuance. We're just going to deal with maybe kind of these top 4 high-level categories. We use int. Default, we don't need to worry about that. Now I'm going to scroll over, and under AI, so AI here is short for auto increment, and if we had fewer columns, you would see in the different layout it can give us, you can see my mouse over, it says auto increment. We're going to click that, and what's handy about that is when I submit a new entry to this database, I'm not even going to have to specify what the contact ID should be. It's going to fill it in for me automatically, so it's always going to be 1 more than the last one it was when I submitted. So if it's my 100th submission of a contact ID, it's going to be contact ID 100 automatically. Even if I've deleted previous entries, it won't fill in old gaps, and that's going to avoid us getting into complicated situations of entries showing up in place of old ones or anything like that. It'll always be a unique number thanks to us checking auto increment here. Many of these other fields you can actually safely ignore for what we're doing. Again, these are things that if you were trying to do trying to become a software engineer expert in backend, it'd be useful for you to know about these different details. We don't really need to worry about that in this case. Index, let's actually make this primary key. That is one thing we're going to look at. That may even be automatic. I'm not sure with auto increment, but that's giving the database a clue about which is the main piece of information we're going to look for as unique between these entries and able to sort through when we do searches on them. So it's a lot of information, I know. For the first entry, the one was actually our +1, right? The one we didn't think about. But let's get back now to sort of the simpler stuff. We're going to have a first name and a last name. You'll see I'm camel casing as always. It's just sort of my personal habit. For type, varchar. I'm going to give these a maximum size. Now there's a couple notes. Again, varchar needs a length to be specified. It has to know how many characters maximum can be, because then the database tries to optimize based on how large that block of text is expected to be at maximum. If we were, what we should not do is we should not say 1,000. We shouldn't say 3,000. We shouldn't err in favor of a huge upper bound. We're kind of doing that a little bit here, but better safe than sorry for people's names. You don't want to put, 35 seems reasonable, and then find out that someone has a really long hyphenated foreign name and they can't put it into your database. So I'm erring in favor of 100, and for the sake of a computer, 30, 100, not a big deal, for the scale of a prototype like we're dealing with. If we were Facebook and we had to deal with just billions of entries possibly in the database from all kinds of things flying at us from every direction, this would be way more worrisome to sort of err in favor of this extra wiggle room. Here it's no big deal at all. And for those columns, we can really kind of ignore the rest. We don't have to worry about the other attributes or possible null state or comments or anything. So we got a first name, we got a last name. Now we said time of birth. And even though there's a date structure in SQL, what I'm going to encourage that we do as a way of getting a better sense for how databases are often kind of wired together under the hood, we're instead going to use the integer value in the Unix timestamp as a birth date, which actually, maybe there's reasons why we shouldn't do that. We'll say time joining, time added. That's what we'll do, okay. And so the reason for this, there's several complications around it. There's something called the Unix timestamp, which is the number of seconds since, heck, I think it's like New Year's, January 70 or January 1970, something along those lines. And that's a way that many time values in databases in PHP get expressed, because it's just a simple integer, easy to pass around, easy to parse. There's things built into PHP and SQL for dealing with those. And we're going to use that for time added, so we'll keep track of when this person was added to the contact list. And we don't need to provide a length or value for that or any other information. And the last bit we're going to do, we're going to provide an address. And this is something we could probably varchar. We could probably overbound me, like the address is never going to be more than, 300 characters. But for sake of illustration, we're going to use text. We could also make this their profile. If we want to have like a user profile they could write about. But this is an illustration of how text differs from varchar. We don't need to add a length or value for it, because text by sort of default allows us to have as much text as we want. We may be able to provide that as a clue to the database, but again, we're not worrying about that level. We just want to get these things up and working. So all that out of the way, we can then scroll down on it. Now, if I was like, oh, if I forgot and I needed to add a column, we could actually wait until after we've already clicked go and then change the structure to go back in and add another column or modify or rename columns. Or we can click save, add one columns, and go, I think would then pop an extra column on there. Save is just going to keep it the way it is. So save. Okay, now when I go into contacts, here we are. So these tabs at the top give us multiple ways of accessing the information. Browse would show us the entries that we have in the database, but we so far don't have any yet. That's why we're seeing a big red X. Structure reveals to us the different columns that we just added and their types and their lengths, as you see here. SQL allows us to manually input SQL commands. So SQL is a whole unique syntax for interacting with a database. You can make special queries to it about how to order information, about what information to filter out, about how to tie together information from two different tables so that they correspond to different entries and different numbers. And we'll show how to do that either later in this video or in a later video. But SQL, if we click on that, is where we can manually enter SQL queries and test them against our database. Also note that these are actually doing modifications to the data. So it's harmless, for example, to do a select query, which just returns results from your database. But if we tried to make calls here to update or insert or delete or so on, those would actually modify the data in the tables. So something to be careful about, but it is to say that when we start writing PHP relations into SQL databases, we're going to have to be writing these SQL snippets, and we can come over here and try it out. If it seems like something's broken about the PHP, we can come over here and verify, is the SQL doing what I think it does, just based on the SQL statement itself, which, like I say, has its own unique syntax. It's not HTML, it's not PHP, it's not Java, it's SQL syntax. Search is currently disabled because we don't have any entries yet to search on. Insert is where we're going to go next. Insert allows us to manually insert entries using phpMyAdmin into the database. And this is really helpful when you're first starting out to be able to hand populate it with some simple data. So when you're accessing it from a website, so when you're browsing through it and doing modifications to it, you can tell, you know it's in there. You know, you're not trying to fix multiple problems at once of, okay, well, I'm trying to fill in my database, but I can't tell if there's anything in there yet, and I can't figure out if my PHP is broken. If you just go to Insert and phpMyAdmin, it's an easy way to interface into it. Contact ID, we leave that blank. I'll remind you that's an auto increment, so that's going to be filled in for us. This one's going to become 1, that one's going to become 2, and so on. First name, we'll put me in there first, just for kicks. Time added. Well, in our PHP, there's ways we can get the current timestamp in the PHP, but I'm just going to go to, if you just Google Unix timestamp, I see that I'm not getting what I expected from that one. There we go. There's the current Unix time. And there's lots of ways to get this off the internet. But for now, I'm just going to pop that in there because that's this moment. So that's when I'm being added to this database. Now my address, number, Gibberish Drive, Atlanta, Georgia. I live in 303 area code. Of course, it's not my real address. But remember, this is a text field, so we could have arbitrary amounts of text in here, and it's not going to run into a cap in the same way that we've set first name and last name to be limited to 100 as varchars. This is a text field. It can be arbitrarily long, arbitrarily detailed text. Just for sake of illustration. Contact ID for the second one, let's make another one. First name, Molly. Last name, Bolly. Time added, roughly the same, except let's add a few seconds, 10 seconds later. Address, Somewheresville, 123 Somewheresville Lane. Also Atlanta, Georgia. Let's put them in 3, same area code. Okay, and you know, address information clearly could be a whole separate field where we have separate entries there for dealing with the city and the state code ID and the zip code separately from the street address. Right now I just want to demonstrate having a text field, and address for contact seems like a suitable way to do that. I'll click go, and that's going to add those 2 entries, and we'll see here we get the confirmation, 2 rows inserted. Now if I go to, so first of all, I want to point out, when I browse up and down here, I can scroll and you see all this text that says like insert into, there's the name of our database, .contacts, here's a list of the fields that are being inserted, values, and you can see here the values that we inputted. This is all SQL syntax. So this is one of the ways to learn SQL syntax, is to observe what phpMyAdmin gives you and returns when you do searches, when you do insertions. It shows you what the SQL commands are that accomplish what it just did. And these are often very explicit in a way that when we're doing them for at least prototyping purposes, we may not go to the same extreme. Let me make sure I'm not leaving things off the bottom of the screen. I just realized that I may have gone off the edge. And we go to Browse, and there's our entries. Contact ID 1, Contact ID 2, first name, last name, time added, address, and so on. And here we could delete them, we can copy them. If I click on Edit, I can go back in and modify the values on one of these if I need to. Go. I can go to Insert and add a 3rd and 4th entry, and so on. Again, Browse now works for us, as does Search, because we have entries in there. And we can search based on particular parameters or things to get values from our contacts. And now this seems almost, this is definitely overkill for 2 entries, but where databases really come in handy is when we're dealing with a ton of information. When you have hundreds of contacts to deal with, potentially thousands or hundreds of thousands. If you've got lots of information archived from a message board, if you've got lots of information to juggle, to the point you don't want to really load it all into arrays simultaneously, databases keep all this information in memory in a way that's very easily filtered, accessed, sorted, and so on. And there's very smart people who figured out highly optimized ways of dealing with both the storage and retrieval of it. And that's what the database provides us. But so for sake of example, our little 2 entries here will probably be sufficient. But now let's take a look at how we're going to access that in the PHP side. And for that, we're going to go to the next video. But so far, hopefully if you're following along, you're comfortable with, you've created a database using the database support feature, but self-serve for Georgia Tech or on your own if you're not a student here. You've then been able to use phpMyAdmin to create a table and give it some basic structure with a few different data types, including an auto-incrementing ID, a couple of varchar fields of fixed size, an integer, which here we're going to use as a timestamp, and a text field, which could be, comments, blog post, could be any length of text. We're using it here for just a text form of an address, just for sake of example. But that's where we're at so far. We're going to continue off that in the next video, so hang on tight. And next video is coming soon, where we're going to use PHP to display and access that information. Thanks.